Hello, friends. Today, let's talk about marriage. My wife and I have been married for a little over 5 years. Now, compared to most of you, that might be a short amount of time, but I've got a couple of theories about marriage. And here's the first theory about marriage. Every relationship is unique. That's very true about my relationship with my wife. In fact, as I reflect over the past and I think about how we got to where we are today, we met in the church building. We met in the youth group. Our very first date was a movie night with the youth group. And from there on out, until today, our relationship has, from its very inception, been built upon the foundation of Jesus Christ. And that's probably true of your marriage as well. You have a unique relationship with your spouse. But secondly, my second theory is this. Over time, every marriage seems to develop its own language. Now, it's true that you might know what your spouse is going to say before they ever say it. But it also might be true that I might make a statement, maybe a sentence or a singular phrase that my spouse understands and knows what it means, but maybe another spouse might not understand it. Maybe another person might not know what I'm talking about. Do you believe this? In Proverbs 18, verse 21, the Bible tells me that the power of life and death are in the tongue. The way that we use our words in marriage is very important because we can use our words in marriage to build up our marriages and make them better. But we can also use our words in marriage to tear down our marriages and essentially destroy them. Now, the golden text when it comes to marriage has to be Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. I mean, you remember what it says. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, it's the golden text for marriage for a couple of different reasons. First, because it's mentioned on two separate occasions outside of Genesis chapter 2 as it pertains to marriage. It's mentioned in Matthew chapter 19 when Jesus provides his teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. He goes all the way back to the creation account. But it's also mentioned in Ephesians chapter 5 when the Apostle Paul, by divine inspiration, is providing this illustration of Jesus Christ and the church. Jesus is the groom, the church is the bride. And then he compares that to the relationship that exists between husbands and wives. And it's a beautiful comparison. But the second reason as to why it has to be the golden text for marriage is because it contains three words or three components that are of great importance to our marriages. Here's the first word. In marriage, there is a leaving. What that means, according to the text, is this. A man shall leave his father and his mother. In marriage, there is a cleaving, and cleave unto a spouse. And in marriage, there is a weaving, and they shall become one flesh. Now, most conversations and discussions that I've ever had with others about the problems that might exist in their marriage can be traced back to these three words. You see, sometimes the problem in marriage is a leaving. Maybe it's because the spouse refuses to leave the home of their parents. You realize that you were not created to live with your parents the rest of your life. You were created to be your own individual. And then sometimes maybe it's because the spouses have had a disagreement or an argument. Maybe there's a conflict in the marriage. And so one spouse goes running to their parents. You'll never guess what she said, or you'll never guess what he said. And they're trying to get their parents on their team, on their side. But what they're really doing is providing their parents an invitation to enter into this disagreement that has occurred in their marriage. And if they're not careful, it's going to cause a lot more problems in their marriage. It's good to get advice and wisdom from your parents, but you see, problems that exist in your marriage need to stay between you and your spouse. And then sometimes in marriage, the problem is a cleaving. Now, the Bible says that a man is to cleave to his spouse, but do you suppose it might be the case that a man might cleave to something like a device in a way that it could hurt his marriage? Do you suppose that a spouse might cleave to someone else who isn't their spouse, or maybe is someone else's spouse, and it can destroy a marriage? You see, I'm to cleave to my spouse. I'm to hold on for dear life. But then thirdly, sometimes problems in marriage can be traced back to this word, weaving. Now, this is what it involves. A weaving is when two individuals take their lives and they become one, and they build one life together. But you see, sometimes in marriage, what you have are two individuals who are leading totally different lives, even though they are married, and it's causing all kinds of problems in their marriage. I think about Genesis chapter 5 in the King James Version of the Bible. It tells me that Eve went by another name. He called their name Adam. That's plural. Two became one. Isn't that amazing? And if you've been married for any appreciable amount of time, you understand the significance and the value of that statement as it pertains to the import in your marriage. That when you marry another person, that what you're doing is becoming one with that individual. It really gives credence and a highlight to God's vision for marriage. God envisioned one man and one woman coming together in marriage and only being married to each other for one lifetime. That's God's vision for marriage. Now, it doesn't seem that this old world has done a very good job putting that vision and allowing it to come to fruition. But the truth of the matter is, not only is it God's vision for marriage, it's God's command for marriage. Now, this is what I want to do in this particular episode. I want to provide you with 7 phrases which are commonly used in my marriage that have helped my wife and I build a marriage that is centered around God. Marriages that are powerful, marriages that are productive. So you could say these are 7 power phrases for a powerful and productive marriage. Here's the first one. Let's put away our phones. Now, from the very inception of our marriage, we have had what we call an open phone policy. Now, what that means is simple, that at any moment of time, my wife can have my phone and go through my text messages or my calls or my social media, and at any moment of time, I can grab her phone and do the same. It's not that we don't trust one another. It's because trust is the very fabric of our marriage. We take it very seriously, and we want to confidently believe in one another that we are carrying out our actions in a way that we are building that trust in our marriage. But then, along with that open phone policy, there have come some other policies as well. So, for example, when we sit down to eat with one another, we put our phones or our devices away. It's an important time to be able to have conversations with your spouse and to be able to have serious discussions with them, not only about marriage, but also just about life in general. But also, when we need to talk, we put our phones or our devices away. And it's very common for us to say something like, let's put our phones away. And she knows and I know what that means. Now, there's a reason for this. Now, Jesus would say in Matthew 6, verse 24, "No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Now, I understand that in the context of that statement, Jesus is talking about money. Mammon means money. And what Jesus is saying is this: as a Christian, as a follower of His, you cannot split your allegiance to Christ and to greed. You must choose one or the other. But can we apply that to our marriages? Do you suppose it might be possible that a spouse would try to serve 2 masters? Maybe they have an unhealthy addiction to social media or to their device, and it's getting in the way of growing their marriage. Maybe instead of having important and intimate conversations with your spouse over a meal, you decide that you are going to spend your entire time on social media. You see, marriages get in trouble when we try to split our allegiance to something else other than our spouse. Maybe it's an unscriptural an unhealthy addiction to something like pornography. Maybe it's adultery, and you're trying to split your allegiance between a mistress and your spouse. You recognize that both of those situations and scenarios are not going to improve your marriage, they're going to destroy your marriage. So let's be careful in our marriages, and let's build the trust that we need to build a healthy and godly foundation. Here's number 2. Baby Daddy Monday. Now to you, that probably means absolutely nothing, but it's a very common phrase in our marriage. Now, if you're a preacher, you know, Mondays are sacred days, but you also understand this. Ministry is very demanding, and oftentimes it's very challenging for families to be able to navigate the rigorous lifestyle of being a preacher or a preacher's wife or the children of a preacher. And there's a principle that I learned that I wish I would have learned long ago. My greatest ministry is my family, and I take that very seriously. So one day out of the week, I take a day, usually Monday, and I spend that entire day with my son, Asher Canaan. The more time that I can spend with him, the more time that I can teach him. The more time that I teach him, the more that I contribute to his life. I'm mindful of what we read in Proverbs 22 and verse 6. Train him up in the way that he should go, and when he is older, he will not depart from it. Do you believe that statement? Because I do. It's a promise of God. But you see, there's a difference between training and telling. Training implies teaching. If I teach him in the way he should go and contribute to his life when he's older, he's going to know the truth, and he's never going to be able to unknow the truth. But if I just tell him the way that he should go, when he's older, he might not know why he is going that way. So I make it my goal, my purpose as a parent, to teach my child the way of God. Psalm 127 verse 5 says, Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. My quiver is truly full, and I am so thankful to be a father. And I'm so thankful that my greatest ministry on this earth will always be my family. Here's number 3. Let me carry your bags. Now, this is one that I say often, and I don't mean this to be braggadocious in any way whatsoever, but I oftentimes request that I can carry my wife's bags. You see, the only bags that my wife is going to carry is the bags that she carries when she's not in my presence. I don't like to see my wife carry heavy things, so I offer to carry her bags for her. It might seem simple. It might even seem insignificant to you. Husbands, do you load and unload the car for your wife? Do you carry in the groceries that maybe she buys at the store? If there is anything in the car that needs to be brought in the house, will you carry it or will you make your wife carry it? I don't like to see Miranda carry heavy things, but the simple principle is this. The Bible tells me that I am to bear the burdens of others. Now, what's that look like in application in my marriage? Do you suppose that my marriage would be better if I bore the burdens of my spouse? Absolutely it would. I mean, I once heard a man who said to his wife, you're going to carry your own bags and you're going to load your own car. Now, I'm not cut from the same cloth as that person. Marriage is about carrying one another's burdens. Now, sometimes that might be so insignificant as carrying a bag around the mall. But then sometimes it might be carrying a burden that she has on her shoulders that she needs help with. Here's number 4. 3 words. I am sorry. Now, oftentimes those words come from my mouth. But let me tell you something. Those 3 words can revolutionize your marriage. James would say, by inspired pen in James 1 and in verse 19, So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Now you realize there's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. We should be quicker to hear than we are to speak. But what if we were to take that phrase that James uses and phrase it a different way? Instead of saying, swift to hear, we instead said, swift to apologize. Do you suppose that the relationships in our lives would be better if we were swift to apologize? What about the relationships that we have with our friends? Do you suppose those would improve if we were quick to admit wrongdoing? What about the relationship that we have with our brethren in Christ? Do you suppose it would contribute to the unity of the Spirit if you and I were willing to quickly apologize and acknowledge our wrongdoings when we have hurt our brethren in Christ? And how do you suppose that pertains to the relationship that we have with our children? Do you suppose that relationship would be better if sometimes we owned up to our mistakes as a parent and apologized sincerely? What about our marriages? Do you think our marriages would be better if we were willing to swiftly apologize when we have done wrong? Now, you're probably like me, and maybe you've done something and you know it hurt your spouse, but just out of spite in the moment, you refused to apologize. Did that help or did that hurt your marriage? Let's not hold bitterness in our hearts. Let's be quick to apologize. Here's another one. I'll always forgive you. Now, biblically speaking, I believe that there are three aspects as it pertains to forgiveness. First, I must be willing to forgive myself. Secondly, I must be willing to forgive others. And thirdly, I must be willing to accept God's forgiveness. But you realize that all three aspects of forgiveness apply to our marriages. So, for example, I must be willing to forgive myself. Do you suppose that's applicable to my marriage? Maybe you're like me and you've done some things that you truly regret, and your past sometimes creeps into your mind, and you recognize, I'm so thankful that God has forgiven me. But you know, the Bible teaches me in Ephesians 5 and verse 28 that if I'm ever to love my wife as a husband, I must first love myself. Maybe you're like me and you know some men who don't love themselves. And because they don't love themselves, it's impossible for them to love their wife, and their marriages are a mess. Would it improve our lives if we forgave ourselves? Yes. Would it improve our marriages if we were willing to forgive ourselves so that we can love our spouse? Absolutely it would. I must love myself if I'm ever to love my spouse in the way that God wants me to love my spouse. But here's the second thing. I must be willing to forgive others. How do you suppose that might apply to our marriages? Now, you know this. Sometimes our spouses will say things in the heat of the moment that hurt us. They don't mean to, perhaps, on purpose. Maybe they say those things on accident and they have unintended consequences as a result of their words. But you and I both know we all make mistakes and we all fail. But when we make those mistakes and we fail and we apologize to our spouse, is it going to make our marriages better if we're quick to forgive our spouse? You know, sometimes what happens in marriage is somebody will say something to you or do something to you, that being your spouse, and maybe they'll apologize. And you'll say, well, I suppose I'll forgive you this time. But you harbor it in your heart. And it grows and it grows and it grows until eventually you have another disagreement or conflict with your spouse. And then you weaponize it against them. What's that called? It's called bitterness. And bitterness has no place in a healthy, godly marriage. Number 3. I must be willing to accept God's forgiveness in my life. Sometimes that's very difficult for people. They make statements like, how could God forgive me? But what's the greatest thing that you can do for your spouse? Here it is. Live a faithful Christian life. Why? Well, because the greatest husband is a faithful Christian and the greatest wife is a faithful Christian. That's what God envisioned for our marriages. And that is what's going to help our marriage become the best it can possibly be. Here's another one. Number 6, I'm listening. Now, it's 2 words. Maybe it seems insignificant to you, but those 2 words can change your marriage. Let me make it applicable to one singular vein in marriage. Do you suppose it might be the case that a man could become so addicted to his devices or other things that they neglect their wife? Maybe they spend a lot of time at work, and so when they come home, instead of spending time with their family, maybe they go right back to work, but they're working at home. Or maybe they go directly to their hobbies, or maybe they go directly to their recreational activities. And instead of spending time with their families, they're continuing to spend time with themselves. What happens when a man neglects his God-given family for a hobby? Well, first, it means that that man is not talking to his family. You realize, husband, you realize that they need you to interact with them and communicate with them. They need valuable time spent with them, and that is on you to put in the effort. But secondly, it also means that maybe that man is not playing or interacting playfully with their children. One of the greatest things that I can do for my children is to play with them, is to spend time with them. Maybe it's not important to you, but it's important to them. If you're playing cars, if you're watching a show, if you're watching a movie, maybe you have daughters and you're playing house, or you go to a tea party, those things are important. But thirdly, if a man goes straight to his hobby instead of spending time with his family, he's not interacting with his wife. He's not giving her the communication she needs. Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Do you suppose it might be the case that sometimes a spouse, a father, a mother can be brought under the power of a social media platform or a phone in a way that would take away from their family and their marriage? Do you suppose that it might be possible for a husband to be brought under the power of a hobby or a recreational activity that they enjoy, and it takes away from priceless time that you're never going to get back, that you should be spending with your family? Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11, when I became a man, I put away childish things. And sometimes we need to man up and put away those childish things and recognize that our family comes first. Number 7, how was your day today? Now, my wife and I, we have a tradition. Every morning I take her to school, and every day I pick her up from school. There's a reason why. You see, when we first got married, we only had one vehicle. It's all we could afford, and so we went everywhere together. Where one of us was, the other one was too. I would take her to school, I would pick her up. And to be honest with you, I really enjoyed it. And so even though we have 2 vehicles, we continue the tradition because it's meaningful to us. But every single day when I pick her up from work, I always ask her the question, how was your day today? Now, I don't ask her that question because I'm looking for some opportunity to tell her how my day was. Oh, well, you'll never guess what happened today in my life. No, I ask that question because I sincerely am looking for an opportunity to listen, and I want to know how her day was. Men, do you realize that sometimes our wives don't want a fixer? They want a listener. Now, I'm afraid that sometimes we've got a little bit more wisdom when it comes to fixing than we do to listening. But you see, sometimes your wife just wants you to listen to what she has to say. She wants you to listen about the problems that she's going through. And there's nothing that you can do to fix them. And more listening will result in more intimacy in our marriages. Every single day, husbands, look your wife in the eyes and ask her the question, how was your day today? And here's the kicker. Really mean it when you ask it. Now, those are 7 powerful phrases that are very common in our marriage that have helped my wife and I create a productive and powerful marriage that is centered around God. But I want to give you a challenge, and here it is. I want to challenge you to sit down with your spouse. Put away all the distractions. Put away your devices. Put away your phone. Turn off the TV. Look your spouse in the eyes and come up with at least 7 separate phrases that are unique to your marriage and the language in your marriage that have helped build trust, build love, and helped create a marriage that is successful. And then really focus on those 7 or more phrases and utilize them often. That's how we know we can build a better marriage. My greatest ministry is my family. Build your house on Jesus. Build your marriage on the Bible. And you will have a successful, happy, and godly marriage. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.